So if everyone's set, I'll introduce myself. So my name's Joey Clark. I'm an ecologist and science communicator. I've been with AWC now for nearly 10 years, and I spent a lot of the first few years up in the Kimberley. So my background is in ecology and research science, but over the last few years, I've focused more on communication. So I now work with the development team in Sydney, and I'd like to acknowledge that the area I work on is Gadigal country. Well, without further ado, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr Eridani Mulder. Eri is joining us from Wongalarra in the Northern Territory. Eri, by way of background, has been with AWC since 2007, and she's worked across nearly every AWC sanctuary. She's spent a lot of time in Northern Australia, and her work has centred around long-term biodiversity monitoring and conservation. Beyond AWC, Eri, many of you will know, she's very keen on reptiles and bats. She's secretary of the Australian Society of Herpetologists, a position she's held for 10 years, and also conservation officer at the Australian Bat Society. So Eri, over to you. You're also working from home. So what does that look like? Can you describe where you are and what your setup is?
Hi everybody. It's so lovely to have you all online because you can't be visiting us out here in the bush at this difficult time. So I'm so happy to welcome you into a little slice of our world out here. And working from home is for us fairly normal, you know. We live and work on an AWC sanctuary, which is Wongalarra up here in the monsoon or wet dry tropics, as Joey pointed out. And we've been adjusting to some logistical and supply issues related to the COVID-19 pandemic. But otherwise, we're really just focused at this time of the year on our day-to-day work as it usually unfolds. At the moment, the sanctuary manager and our land management officers are out creating fire breaks and starting the early dry season burning. I'm spending office time reporting, but also assisting with some of those land management programs through some weed work, which I was out doing yesterday, and also working in our on-sanctuary offices in our houses, as many people are, to keep all those wheels turning behind the scenes.
Now, I'll just share a location map for people who haven't been to Wongalarra. This is where Eri is at the moment. Eri, how remote is it? Like, how do you get to Wongalarra from somewhere that we've heard of before?
So the capital of the Northern Territory obviously is Darwin, but that's about 9 hours from us. So our nearest large centre is Katherine, which most people are probably familiar with. There's really only 3 large towns in all of the NT. So for us, that's a 300-kilometre drive. We take the Central Arnhem Road, which is the major entry route into Arnhem Land. And that road, depending on current maintenance, can take us 4 to 5 hours to get from here to Katherine.
And your job normally involves a lot of travel. So people on this call may have met you at various sanctuaries around Northern Australia. Usually we have to find you from the air and you're camped out with a bunch of ecologists setting traps and catching animals. Which sanctuaries do you normally work across? And are you able to access all of them, or has that become impossible?
It's not impossible, it's just adjusting. I'm part of the Northeast regional team, which includes Queensland and the top end NT. So 5 properties in Queensland and 3 in the Northern Territory that I work across. I manage the science program across our top end properties. So that's Pungalina, 7 and the Gulf, which I know quite a lot of you have visited. Wongalarra, which is here at the southeastern edge of Arnhem Land. And our brand new partnership with Bullo River Station, which is over in the East Kimberley, so almost on the WA border. So I do a lot of traversing of the top end NT. We are staying at home at the moment as part of protective measures, particularly for Indigenous communities across the Northern Territory, which is really important both for us and those communities. And currently we're working on looking at ways that we can continue with important ecological monitoring work here at Wangaratta and further afield, perhaps later in the year. So just a process of adjustment, and I'm lucky here that we are quite easily able to self-isolate, and we have a team of 5, and so we can adjust and work together to get some of those surveys done.
Okay, so based in Northern Australia, but over the last few months, our attention has been drawn to Southern Australia and especially the southeast. As many of you will know, the bushfires which burnt through southeastern Australia this last summer were unprecedented in scale. I think one estimate I saw was that around 7.5 million hectares of temperate forest were burnt. Nothing of that scale has ever happened before, and it left a devastating impact on wildlife. So, you know, the best guess is that well over 1 billion native animals perished in those fires, and that's just looking at vertebrates, so not even thinking of plants and invertebrates. So this massive disaster for wildlife in the southeast. AWC, luckily, wasn't impacted directly by the fires, so they didn't affect any of the areas where our sanctuaries are. But it also meant that we were in a really good position to offer our assistance. As you know, we've got most of our team based in the field. 80% of our staff are based on sanctuaries doing practical work. And that meant we've got this really amazing talent pool of people to draw upon. So in the immediate aftermath, you know, the priorities were to get out there on the ground and, first of all, well, Eri, I might throw to you, you know, what were the priorities? And do you want to just mention the different sites where we've been involved, just briefly?
Yeah, obviously it was pretty devastating to watch the fires unfold over the sort of early summer 2019, over Christmas, New Year, into January. And it just seemed to never stop. You know, you're watching enormous, critically important areas of habitat go up in smoke, literally. And so for me personally, and also I think for most of AWC's ecologists, there was a real feeling that, you know, if we can possibly help out, then everyone was extremely enthusiastic to get on board and do that. So AWC's response was driven by our engagement initially through our CEO, Tim Allard, with the Threatened Species Commissioner and the federal government in roundtables around what the priorities were, and other institutions that were developing, trying to do that rapid assessment of what species and ecosystems had been enormously impacted. And from that, you know, various offers of assistance were made around the place, and we were able to fortunately offer assistance to a number of projects. So the first was with South Endeavour Trust, another small non-government organisation, a conservation group that, like us, holds pieces of land for the purposes of conservation. But they have not much in the way of staff or equipment to be able to do surveys, and so they were in a position where they really needed some rapid assessment of reserves that had been burnt to look at where they could direct their conservation efforts in the future for those ecosystems and landscapes. We also offered our assistance because of expertise with bird surveys and habitat surveys to surveying regent honeyeater habitat in the Blue Mountains, so looking at how impacted those areas of breeding habitat were. Obviously, what we're going to be talking about more today, the fencing project and essentially emergency rescue of the Kangaroo Island dunnart on Kangaroo Island, and also a unique project in the Blue Mountains where we assisted with recovery of a small koala population that's genetically unique and therefore very important. And that was with an organisation called Science for Wildlife, working with Taronga Zoo.
Yeah, great. So a bunch of different projects there. And I should have said, but you're actually coordinating the efforts of our ecology team and their assistants. Might just start with the Regent honeyeater. So this is an exceptionally rare bird. Even before the bushfires this summer, the estimate for their total population was around 400 individuals. So exceedingly rare, right on the brink. They were once more widespread along the east coast in eucalypt woodlands from Victoria right up to the Queensland border. Really beautiful birds. Some of you may have seen them in the KPD Valley or down in Victoria. And a huge area of their distribution was impacted by fire. So what were we able to offer for that project, Eri?
Well, we were really fortunate. One of our ecologists, Dr Mulder, actually did her PhD on woodland birds around Canberra, and so really extensive local and specific knowledge on bird surveys and the type of habitats they're in. And so we were able to basically just make Donna available to go down and rapidly survey around 200 known habitat sites to look at the fire intensity there. So a lot of these surveys, it's really critical that it happens as soon as possible after the fires, so that scientists and ecologists have some idea of ecosystem recovery or lack thereof, and so can make better decisions about future conservation actions for those species.
Yeah, so that was a really urgent priority to get out and assess the impact on habitat for that bird. In northern New South Wales, the fires went through a bit earlier, so that was kind of late spring, early summer. And you mentioned the group South Endeavour Trust. So AWC has helped out on a couple of their properties. I'll just bring up the map to show you where those are located. So South Endeavour Trust is a small private conservation group, and two of their properties that were impacted by fire are on the north coast of New South Wales. So Kuwilpa, that's kind of lowland swamp country between Ballina and Coffs Harbour. Besant's Lease is on the New England tableland, so high altitude eucalypt woodland. Eri, you've been on the ground at both of those places just after the fire. So can you describe what it looked like in the aftermath of those big hot fires?
Yeah, it's pretty devastating. I mean, I work in an environment that, fire is one of our biggest tools. We use it to deliver most of our conservation outcomes across Northern Australia. But it's a very different beast when it's these extremely hot, extensive summer fires that are ripping through eucalypt woodland. And nothing can really prepare you for what that looks like until you're standing in it. And I reached these places approximately 6 weeks after the bushfire. And as Joey said, Kuwilpa is, it's got a lot of lowland billabongs, Melaleuca alternifolia, so tea trees, flooded gums, and essentially nowhere that we went had any canopy left, so they're scorched right to the tops of the trees. There's no ground cover whatsoever. Kuwilpa fared a little bit better because it is wetter, so there was still water and some vegetation in some of those wetlands. But for fauna that exists, that relies on a ground layer and complexity of vegetation, it's pretty dire outlook for them. Besant's Lease has some small advantages in that it's in rocky granite tor country on the New England tableland. So part of the reason that we were surveying there is to see if a whole range of really threatened important species were still persisting there, and to provide some baseline data for South Endeavour Trust about where they could target their efforts in future.
Yeah, so there's a number of threatened species up there. What were we targeting specifically at Besant's Lease?
So Besant's Lease is a fantastic place to see it. It's quite spectacular. It's bounded by butterleaf conservation park, and it's there were only incidental records existing for South Endeavour Trust where people had encountered species in the course of other land management activities like fencing and feral animal control. And so they had an idea that these species were there, but no real idea of distributions or, of course, persistence post-fire. And so some of those things that we were trying to find are things like superb lyrebirds, there's common wombats there, and in particular spotted-tailed quolls, which are nationally threatened species and really important part of the ecosystem there.
So I've just got some of the camera trap images up now. So essentially we had a couple of ecologists on the ground for, was it 2 weeks or longer, setting camera traps?
We actually did the surveys really rapidly, and so at both properties we deployed camera traps from the Cairns office from the northeast region, flew staff down, and they got through all of these camera trap deployments, bird surveys, spotlighting and collecting incidental records in just over a week.
It's funny when you say we just flew staff down from Cairns. We used to do that, but now
we did do that.
So it was actually kind of good timing in that we were able to get a lot done in that immediate aftermath in, you know, the month or two just following the fires. Luckily, we were able to get a lot of this work done before the travel restrictions had too much of an impact. So this is a superb lyrebird. That was one of the things they picked up at Bezant's lease. The other really exciting record was this one. Can you introduce us to this animal?
Yes, this is the mythical and elusive spotted-tailed quoll. So this is a carnivorous marsupial. So in this type of ecosystem, this would be the top predator for that whole region. And they're distributed through New South Wales into Queensland all the way up to the wet tropics, and really very threatened now. They probably about 800 grams to over a kilo, and it was just so exciting to see these pop up on camera traps. And our ecologists were actually also lucky enough to see one during the course of spotlighting surveys as well. So we think that they probably survived by sheltering in the granite outcrops and tors, and also there's quite a population of common wombats there. So there was evidence that lots of animals were utilising those old burrows to escape from the fires.
Yeah, right. So those rapid ecological assessments, that's something that, you know, we're really ideally placed to help out with things like that. We've got the equipment, we've got the staff ready to go. I guess because it was the wet season too, typically that's a bit of a quieter time for our field teams. So they were rapidly able to go out to all of these different projects and assess the impact of the bushfires. But in other situations, there was a need for a more dramatic intervention. So I've never been to Kangaroo Island before, but I hear it's very beautiful, beautiful mallee woodlands and other eucalypt forest. Eri, you had been there before the fires. Can you describe what the landscape is like and what some of the threatened species there are?
Yeah, you're right, Joey. Kangaroo Island is incredibly beautiful. So it's obviously isolated from the mainland, about 25 k's at the shortest point, which you can get to by ferry. And there's a range of habitat there. So the mallee woodland that Joey's talking about, taller, more open woodland with a sort of quite dense, almost heathy understory, which is composed of some really unique plants. KI has lots of really big old grass trees, which the locals call yaccas, and also there's quite a lot of developed agricultural and pastoral land in various sections. But most of the western end of the island is incredibly beautiful Flinders Chase National Park, and really significant populations of species that are either unique to Kangaroo Island or form populations which are only found there. So these are things like obviously the Kangaroo Island dunnart, Kangaroo Island subspecies of the echidna, southern brown bandicoots, southern emu wrens, Bassian thrushes, and glossy black cockatoos.
Yeah, so a whole lot of locally endemic subspecies, and then this really special animal that you mentioned, the Kangaroo Island dunnart. Some of you will have met dunnarts at other AWC sanctuaries. So there's about a dozen species around Australia. This one is restricted to Kangaroo Island, and even before the fires, you know, they were very limited. So they'd only been found at about 8 locations on KI before the fires. And the estimate, well, when you look at the map, it was about 97% of their known range that was burnt. And the fires down there were very hot. So, you know, from the pictures area, it looks like there was just ash on the ground. Canopies and even whole tree trunks had just been decimated.
Yeah, Kangaroo Island was completely devastated with the extent of the fire. So around 50% of the entire island was burnt, and that was all on the western end. And although the eastern end of the island was unburnt, that's not a habitat where Kangaroo Island dunnarts have ever been recorded. So as Joey pointed out, a really devastating event for this particular species. And visiting Flinders Chase National Park, which I'd seen some years earlier, it was really actually quite hard to comprehend the intensity of those fires. And speaking with the ecologists from our major partner there, which is Kangaroo Island Land for Wildlife, it was just incredible to think that some of these areas actually ended up being burnt twice and not a small fire the first time, equally intense both times, because there's this process of burning through the understory, and then what was left of the crown was scorched and fell, and then a second fire burnt through that as well. And so in a lot of areas, it's heartbreaking to see, because it's almost a moonscape. There's nothing but sand, ash and dead sticks left in those environments, and it's difficult to imagine when you're looking at it, you know, where would an animal the size of the Kangaroo Island dunnart, or even a southern brown bandicoot, you know, where do those animals find shelter? And it isn't like they can move to a refuge nearby, because there is literally nothing for multiple tens of kilometres in every direction in some places.
We also know that from research we've done elsewhere, so especially in the Kimberley, that there's an interaction between intense fires like that and the behaviour of feral predators. So we know that cats will move long distances to hunt in areas that have been affected by intense fire. It means that animals like that dunnart are left extremely vulnerable to predation. So I guess the good news is that AWC has a very strong track record of protecting small mammals using conservation fencing. Eri, can you talk about who we're working with on the ground on Kangaroo Island, and that process of planning and then deciding to construct the feral predator-proof fence?
Of course, it's I guess that's the light in the darkness of visiting Kangaroo Island, is the point of when I went there was to deploy a science team to assist our major partner, which is Kangaroo Island Land for Wildlife. And they, the ecologists there live on Kangaroo Island, and so they were part of the firefighting efforts and trying to preserve KI dunnart habitat and other threatened species habitat in the face of these fires, as it was approaching those areas, and doing everything they could to try and save them. But the reality is that, you know, the fires are so intense and fast moving that that wasn't always possible. But what it also meant was that immediately after the fires, as soon as it was safe for them, they were able to go out and start resurveying those areas where they knew Dunarts had lived. And part of our response was to help them by providing camera trapping equipment, because a lot of their equipment was still in the field when the fires went through, and so it was burnt. And then the next action we took was to provide a feral animal control officer. So an AWC employee who, Murray Schofield, who's worked extensively across our other fenced feral predator-proof reserves, and so he was able to go there and immediately start reducing some of that impact from feral cats. So Pat and Heidi from KI Land for Wildlife, they had a small win in those first couple of weeks, in that they identified a tiny refugial patch, which is within that what looks like a road on the map that Joey's sharing. And the size of this refuge, I mean, the scale is so much smaller than anything we've ever had in AWC, and it highlights how critical it was to move quickly on this, because it's hard to comprehend how thin of a thread they might be holding on by, because the patches are so small. So the size of this patch, I think we stepped it out, and it was something like 20 meters by 50 meters, and that was the only green vegetation in the near vicinity. And so KI Land for Wildlife had started some protective measures with us, but also with other partners through FAME, Foundation for Australia's Most Endangered, and WWF. And so we were able to provide the final piece in that puzzle, in the fact that we have expertise and ability to move really quickly to install a feral predator-proof fence around this tiny patch, so an area of 13.7 hectares. And by mobilising those staff and contractors and equipment, from when the contractors hit the ground at KI, that fence was up in 8 days. And so I've worked in a lot of AWC's predator-proof areas, and so I've been there and seen how effective they are, and done maintenance and all those sorts of things, but I've never had the fantastic experience of actually watching one go up, and it's quite incredible. And the sense of relief when the fence is closed, and you then know that there's no chance that any more feral predators can move in, and then it's a case of just putting in the hard yards to ensure that there's no cats inside the fence. And that's just some amazing breathing room to think, okay, so those animals are now safe, and we can focus on what our longer term goals and directions are for recovering that species.
Eri, I just want to pick up on the 8 days. That's incredible. So, we had that experience with the marla at New Haven back in 2017, where there was a population in the centre which required a safe place to be transferred to. And I think that whole project took about 6 to 8 weeks to build a small refuge for the marla. We thought we were doing pretty well there, but 8 days, that's by far and away a new record. A huge tribute to the hard work of you, of also Joe Schofield, who was brought on board to oversee the logistics and construction of the project there. I think you deserve a huge congratulations for that.
Yeah, it really is a huge team effort though, and we were lucky to be able to partner with KI Land for Wildlife, and also the landowners here, who are the Dobe family, who immediately agreed that this was a critical action for Kangaroo Island Dunarts, and that they would provide their land with a refugial patch for us to construct the fence. The Australian Defence Force were on site assisting with fire recovery efforts, and they literally within a couple of days said, yes, we have skilled operators and equipment, and we can bulldoze the fence line for you. And so all these things, just one after the other, to enable this project to happen. But yeah, it really is incredible. You know, we're going out monitoring and checking cat traps and camera trapping, and you'll go one day, and then the next day all the fence posts will be up, and then the next day all the wire will be up, and yeah, it's quite incredible.
Fantastic. So that's we're calling that the critical refuge. So that's a relatively small area at the moment. There are plans for a longer term and larger scale presence on Kangaroo Island. Can you talk about stage 2, what we've got planned, and what that means for this species?
For sure. And stage 2 was always part of the original plan. It was really about working out that first action which would provide the best support for the species in the short term. So we knew we had to do something. We couldn't wait to build the whole big fence in order to secure those tiny populations. And so a lot of work has gone on other private land outside of the critical refuge and the Dobe family property at the same time that this fence was being built, and we were still monitoring inside. We were also monitoring other places where there were former Kangaroo Island Dunnart records, and the really amazing news was that the last time I visited Kangaroo Island at the end of February, one of the camera trap sites that we had set up in another tiny refuge patch in the area where the second stage fence is due to go, we detected Kangaroo Island Dunnarts at that site, and also detected echidnas and Rosenberg's heath monitors and Bassian thrushes at that site. So a really good indicator that there are other populations of the Dunnarts persisting outside of the critical refuge, which is equally as important as the refuge. So the second stage is around 300 hectares, and it will encompass the critical refuge. So that larger fence will join on to the smaller fence, and that's also on the Dobes family property. So we will have a contract with them. Essentially, they want their land to be conservation land for KI Dunnarts, and so we're able to help them achieve that with KI Land for Wildlife, and provide ongoing feral animal control support. So Murray is still on the island. He's chosen to be isolated there so we can keep working, removing cats from a number of really important sites, and also maintaining that critical fence checking protocol for the initial smaller refuge area. And so those processes are still continuing on KI because the ecologists live there and Murray is based there. And Joe Schofield, the Southeast Regional Ops Manager, who has managed this whole fence construction and KI project, is still working through getting the approvals for the fence. And so we have a timeline for building that, and yeah, we continue to work on it. So it's really encouraging that we're able to keep going with those bits of that work where we're able to at the moment.
A few people have said this, but I think it's incredibly lucky that we didn't have both crises at the same time, that we were able to get in there before travel restrictions and make sure there's a secure population of Dunnarts. It would not be a good
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, aside from that, regardless of how many crises we have at the moment, I think AWC is an organisation that has that adaptability and, you know, go get 'em attitude that we can adjust to almost anything to try and achieve the conservation goals and rescue some of those really threatened species where we can.
Yeah, it's a good point. Just a shout out to the field staff who are tuning in, because I know there's a bunch of people, AWC ecologists and land managers, operational staff, tuning in from sanctuaries where they are now isolated. So they're, you know, they may be isolated normally, but now they're especially isolated and it's enforced. Now, don't forget, you can ask questions in the chat. So just click chat. Yep, got a shout out from Mornington there. Thank you. If you've got anything that you'd like us to address, send a message in the chat so we can answer that. We've also got some questions that people sent in beforehand, so we might address some of those. A question here about AWC's fire management techniques that we use in Northern Australia and how much of that work is applicable in Southern Australia. I guess my take on that, Eri, is that there are big differences in the ecosystems that we work in between Northern Australia and Southern Australia. So while a lot of the fire management that we do is in tropical savanna dominated by grasses and sparse trees, that's very different to the forest fires that we faced in southeastern Australia. But I think some of the things that we can learn from our work elsewhere is that a science-based approach is really important. And just that the attitude to fire, that, you know, we see fire as a tool that you can use to manage a landscape. I think it's very easy to switch into thinking it's always a threat and it's always a disaster. But in large parts of Southern Australia, that's how it's seen. I think a lot of our work now will be looking at how we can adapt some of our fire management stuff and apply that in different ecosystems. Eri, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just agree with you, Joey, that a scientific approach is really important. And I don't say that in the sense that only scientists have the answers, but in the sense that adapting to that requires listening to all of the available information and working out how to apply that to the different ecosystems. And so, yeah, I definitely agree that fire is probably the biggest and best tool we have, and changing that perception around it being something really negative to something that's really positive, and also very unique to Australia in the fact that we can use it that way and that it can be extremely beneficial. And that process is probably what will save us from another series of horrifying events like this.
Yeah. So we're getting quite a lot of questions, so we may not have time to address all of them. If you have questions that we don't answer, please just get in touch. So give us a call or send an email and we'll try and address that after this is over. Another one here, Eri, about how the efforts were coordinated on Kangaroo Island, and how different organisations, you know, I guess more broadly, have been working together in response to the bushfire disaster.
On Kangaroo Island specifically, obviously when the fires first happened, there's so many different facets of it that require support, you know, people, agriculture, wildlife rescue, ecosystems, specific species, and a lot of those were, like ours, emergency responses. But one of the reasons I was last on Kangaroo Island, which was an amazing event, is coordinated by the Threatened Species Recovery Hub and the National Environmental Science Program, was the Kangaroo Island Wildlife Recovery Workshop. And so that brought all of the stakeholders involved in wildlife on KI together. So that includes AWC and government departments, other not-for-profits like our partners, local landholders, other people with interests, local council, tourism operators, and also those broader federal organisations that might have students who are studying specific species or might have recovery programs. So an example of that is the glossy black cockatoos. And that process was to bring together the best knowledge that we had on all of the threatened species and ecosystems on Kangaroo Island in light of the fires, to build a collaborative and coordinated approach to recovery for them.
Great, thanks. All right, another question here. So a couple of questions actually about Kangaroo Island on the ground. The first one, how many Dunarts do we estimate are there now after the fire? And I think I can safely say no one has a good idea of that. Is that right?
That's correct. It's so hard to detect Dunarts. I mean, I didn't meet someone on Kangaroo Island until the wildlife recovery workshop who'd actually even seen one in real life, because nearly all the records are from camera traps. They're incredibly hard to trap. We know very little about their natural history. And that low detection rate and knowledge of their life and habits means that it's very, very difficult to estimate how many there might be in the whole population. But it's safe to say that nobody would be willing to give an estimate above 500. This is before the fires. And so we know that there's a handful that have been detected on camera traps, both on private land and on National Park Estate now through Department of Environment and Waters work. And so we're trying to work on how to distinguish individuals, but they have very kind of standard fur colors and not very many markings that allow us to tell them apart. And so we're looking at activity and times on different camera traps to try and look at individuals and work out how many there are. But I guess the main takeaway from that is that it is critically important that those known locations are protected as best we can, because those individuals are the foundation of their species recovery.
Yeah. All right. Conscious of time, so I might just answer a couple more questions. Again, if we don't get to yours, please get in touch. And if not, we'll try and get in touch with you and provide an answer to all of your burning questions. All right. So another question about how the COVID restrictions have affected our operations, especially with fire management. So a really great example of how we're able to respond to this is up in the Kimberley, where, you know, the prescribed burning program was just getting underway as the lockdown came into effect. That meant that our team up there had to decide, okay, what do we do? Do we, go ahead with the prescribed burning, which we know needs to be done, or do we abandon it and let millions of hectares burn in wildfires later in the year? For us, that's not a real option. So we decided that in order to deliver that fire management across millions of hectares in the central Kimberley and beyond, not just on our sanctuaries, but also on neighbouring properties, we'd actually isolate that whole operational team. So a bunch of the Kimberley operations staff travelled to Charnley River Station, and they've basically been quarantined there and running our entire Kimberley fire management program from Charnley. So that's one way that we've been able to continue our operational work on the ground, despite, and kind of because of the isolation of that site. That's the kind of way that, in some ways the isolation helps us to continue work as normal. And Eri, as you've said, your work at Wongalara can continue, although you're probably not travelling to so many sanctuaries now.
No, that's true. And it's quite similar. Our early dry season burning program, which is our critical fire management for the year, is just starting to kick off. So that's a combination of aerial and ground burning. And so the ground burning, it's essentially all hands on deck. I'll be out doing some of that later this week with our manager, Chris Watley. And we also, have similar processes around contractors and working out COVID-19 management plans with our aerial contractor and our staff here, in the sense that we are able to isolate them and, get those aerial burning runs completed.
A couple of comments here, just saying that it's so positive to hear these stories. Another one just says, love you, thank you for everything. So that's very nice. Thank you. And thank you all for your support, because none of this work and none of our team would be able to do any of this work without your support. So, you're part of this effort as well. On that note, I might take just one more question, a really important one, which is, how can we help besides just donating money? We rely really heavily on word of mouth and, the networks of people that you're socially in contact with from a distance can be really helpful for AWC. So if you know anyone that would be interested in hearing about our work or who you think might be able to support what we're doing, please put them in touch. You can even, I might do a plug for next week too. So you can even invite people to these webinars just by sharing the link with them and they can register that way. That's a really helpful thing at the moment. Considering we're all fairly limited in movement at the moment, volunteering is probably off the table for the next few months at least, but that's another way that you can help once restrictions ease. So get in touch with the team and we can find a volunteering opportunity out on one of our sanctuaries. I can't wait to get back out there. I'm kind of missing the sanctuary visits, stuck in my office in Sydney. And I think I was going to be at New Haven at the moment, so bit of a change of scene. But I hope through this discussion, we've given you a bit of an insight into what's going on the ground and how a lot of that work is still able to continue. Thank you again for all of your support. Next week, we've got another conversation about the bushfire recovery projects. And this one is specifically about rescuing a population of koalas in the Blue Mountains. And I'll be talking to Andy Howe, one of our wildlife ecologists, about that. So thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you for your support. And thank you, Eri, for joining us from Wongalara. The internet held up and I think that went really well. If you've got any feedback about how we could do things better, let us know. Otherwise, I'll catch you next week. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody. It's been really lovely to have you all here and connect with people all over the place. And I'd really just like to reiterate what Joey has said. You know, every day of my life on a sanctuary, I'm very aware that we wouldn't be here and able to do this without your support. So it's quite amazing to be part of that enormous, bigger AWC family. So thank you so much.
Okay, we'll see you next time. Thank you.